How do you get a high yield out of a small garden? Today I'm going to talk to you about it. G'day there, I'm Dana from Pewakaka Valley Homestead, and today I'm going to be talking to you about how to get the most out of your garden that you have. You don't need a big garden to be able to grow a decent amount of food for your family, and I'm going to show you some different ways that you can use to get the most out of your garden space that you do already have. Personally, we like to use raised beds for our gardens. This is partly because they're tidier and I like them to be tidy, but it's also because you can plant them more intensively. You can make sure that you're only feeding the garden. They warm up faster in the springtime, they drain better, especially in the springtime when everything's so wet and soggy. And you can plant them more intensively. You can put more in there because you know that they're well amended beds. You're not having to put pathways up through them and that sort of thing. Your raised beds can be made from anything, any materials that you already have, or you can literally just mound them up from the soil, just digging out the walkways and flicking them up onto the garden to give yourself a raised space. Raised beds are also easier to protect from pests and anything that's going to try and get in there and eat your vegetables. The next thing you really want to be doing is keeping the weeds out of your main garden. They steal nutrients from your plants and they can often harbour pests. There are some beneficial weeds that are good to grow. There's sort of this movement happening of letting weeds happen. And I do let them happen, but sort of around the edges and not in my main garden, because a strangled choked plant, the weeds will always grow faster, and a strangled choked plant just won't grow well. So I keep my garden beds themselves as weed free as I can, but I do let things like dandelion and all those sorts of flowering things that the beneficial insects do enjoy, I let them grow sort of around the edges and the pathways instead. Another thing I really strongly recommend people do in their gardens, especially if you're wanting to get a high production out of it, is to mulch your garden. So there are so many options you can use for mulch. Personally, nowadays I mulch with a mixture of either compost or the lawn clippings. So once a year I do a good layer of compost, and then after that we use the lawn clippings over the top as a mulch to help keep the weeds down. It also helps keep the moisture in and help keep the moisture levels nice and steady. And so that combination of keeping the weeds down and keeping the moisture levels up, as well as feeding the soil, means that I get a lot better growth out of my plants. You can use wood mulch or pea straw, or even just normal farm straw. You can use hay, but what I find, seeing as I'm sitting in the hay shed, you'll find that your hay is probably full of all these little seed heads that just grow grass, which is not what I want to be fighting in my garden. So I know the roof stout method is really popular and that people use hay. I don't know if maybe you can get hay that are cut before the seed heads happen, but our hay here is always full of seed, and I just refuse to put it on my garden or anywhere near the garden. Even the goats' bedding, which is usually hay, we scoop that out and it goes out in the food forest. I don't want it in my veggie garden. Shredded paper, cardboard, coconut core. There's quite a few other bits and pieces that you can use as mulch as well. Obviously use whatever you have access to. Tarping is another quite a good way of killing off weeds without having to introduce chemicals which can stunt the growth of your plants. So to tarp something, you literally are just putting some black polythene or some silage tarps over the top of your soil and weighting them down, and then you just want to wait sort of 3 to 4 weeks, maybe longer if you've got the time, and it will naturally kill off the residual crops as well as killing off the weeds. The other thing you need to be doing to get a good crop from your garden is to make sure you're feeding the soil. Feed it and feeding the plants. So feeding the soil, that's when you're adding your organic matter, adding plenty of compost, and mulching. Those things build the soil web, and the soil web breaks down the nutrients and helps feed the plants with it. The other thing would be adding some liquid fertilizer. We have a seaweed solution that we use, maybe blood and bone solution, and dilute that down and put it, you can put it both on the leaves of the plants and around the roots, and the plants will soak up those nutrients directly. They're not relying on the soil the same. So we do a combination of those, and we find that we get a lot better plant growth when we do that. They have a high nitrogen content, which helps with the growth of those leafy greens. and it's well worth the time and effort to feed the plants directly. The next tip to getting the most out of the garden you have is to grow what grows well in your area. I am this season committing a garden bed to a sweet potato that I am not convinced will grow here, but I am going to experiment on it, because if it does, my husband will be very excited because he loves it. However, generally speaking, we stick to plants that we know grow here. We know that do well in our climate. I'll often have an experiment plant or two, but we tend to stick with ones that we know that grow, because that's our best way of getting the best harvest out of the smaller space that we have. The other trick is to make sure you grow what you eat. There is no point in growing vast quantities of broccoli if your family can't stand the stuff. So only grow what you know you're going to eat, or that you have a home for bartering, giving away, or preserving, that sort of thing. Growing vertically is probably one of the best things you can do to get the most out of a small space. A lot of things will vine upwards, especially with a little bit of help. Beans, peas, and then all your cucurbits, so pumpkins, cucumbers, zucchinis, summer squash, all those sorts of things. You can grow up a trellis, and that will free up a whole lot of ground space. Another way of growing up is to add some guttering to a wall that you might have in the garden, or even just between some posts. Some guttering, or even just some small troughs that are filled with some potting mix, will grow plants that have the smaller root system. So your leafy greens, your lettuces, even some herbs like thyme, don't mind stuff like that, and strawberries, of course, are quite commonly grown in gutters. So that's a really good way of making use of some vertical space. You can put multiple rows of them, and some people, I've even seen them have them sort of tip alternately, so you pour water on one end and they just carefully, slowly but surely drip their way through. It's worth experimenting with and seeing what you can make work at your place. Succession gardening is probably the next really big key to get your head around. This is when you are planting one plant after another. You're not just doing a single plant for your garden and then harvest what's there and then put it away for the winter. It is basically keeping roots in the ground as much as possible. And I have a video on that which I am going to link. Oh dear, I never remember one side or the other. I'll put it up there for you anyway. Most seed packets will tell you to plant X number of inches apart, and those are usually set up to allow for machinery to come through. They're kind of designed more for commercial growing, and you will probably find that a lot of those plants can be planted even at half that distance and still get a really good crop from them. So the more intensively you can plant your space, the more plants you're going to get out of it. You can do it with the same plants, or you may like to space those ones out and then put in between them some other plants that may use a slightly different space. You might want to grow carrots in between your lettuces, or lettuces in between tomatoes, or that sort of thing, where they're using, you know, your tomatoes are growing tall, your lettuce can kind of grow broad around the bottom. There are also smaller varieties where they tend to be either labelled dwarf or early, and they will come to maturity quicker, they take up less space, and you can often get a really good sized harvest off some of the smaller plants. Dwarf beans, dwarf peas, you can get tiny little pumpkins. I'm not very good at growing pumpkins, to be honest, but last year I grew one called Baby Bear, and they were just sort of this big. And I got lots of them, whereas previously I've never managed to get actual fruit to grow. And I grew a type of corn, which was an early corn, and despite our really not very hot, quite short, usually can't grow corn sort of weather, we managed to get quite a harvest. So this year I'm going to try even more. And this companion planting sort of malarkey works quite well. We're going to try the corn, beans and pumpkins. Corn, beans and pumpkins all in the same garden bed. We're going to try that this year and see how we get on with those. And then that's a really good way of making use of the height and the ground. And as long as your soil's really well fed, you can get quite a substantial harvest out of one single garden bed when you start companion planting like that. Catch crops are another option where you are sneaking extra crops in empty spaces. Radishes make a brilliant catch crop because they're ready in 3 or 4 weeks. So if you have an empty place, you can throw some radish seeds around, and as you're harvesting your other things, your radish will grow up and you can get those out, and they're kind of just like a little bonus crop. And the other thing that can really help with the rotation of getting as much out of that garden bed as possible would be to grow starts. So you grow your transplants in trays so that they've already got a 4 to 6, maybe even 8 week head start, rather than growing everything from seed in your garden. High yield varieties, some plants are known for being really high yield. Sweet 100 tomatoes, one example, they're a cherry tomato, and they just put out boatloads, and I believe there's even a eventuation, like a new one from there that produces even more fruit. So try looking for sort of the ones that say heavy producer, high yielder, those sorts of things, and aim for those varieties that you know are going to do well in your area, as well as giving you extra produce. If you're going to have a plant in the ground, you may as well be growing the one that's going to give you the most produce at the end of it. I've brought you up to the garden. I was hoping to be able to do the garden-y talk up in the garden, but it's been so windy up here that it was affecting the sound. So the wind seems to have died down for a minute, so I thought I'll show you around a little bit. In this garden here you can see we have got, these are some young cabbages that are doing really well, and then beside here I've got some peas growing along the edge and a bit of carrot for some reason. So we do try and keep as many weeds out of here as possible. Obviously there's a few little ones picking up. I need to get out here and do some more weeding. So these weeds, if they got too big, they would take away quite a lot of the nutrients from the plants. It's a tiny little carrot that missed harvest. Over here's another example of interplanting things. I've got some peas. These guys are nearly ready to start staking. And these are some red onions. And then I've got more peas over the back, and then at the end here I've got some potatoes. And these are the potato onions that I showed you in an earlier video, and they've all come up. So these are a single onion, kind of like a little pickling onion that you put into the ground, and they turn into 4 or 5 whole onions. So they're quite fun to grow. And this is our succession of lettuces and salad crops. And then you can see I've got some smaller lettuce over the back. And then over here I've got some little red cabbages growing and sown in between them. I've got some radishes just as a little catch crop while these guys are getting bigger. Considering it's early spring, I'm really happy with how my garlic's growing. These are elephant garlic, these 2 rows, and these are just a normal garlic. Unfortunately it appears we've got rust already. So no, it is what it is. Hopefully we get an alright harvest. I hope you found this video useful. If you have, hit the like button, consider subscribing to our channel. We bring you videos twice a week on growing and preserving your own food and other homesteading bits and pieces. We'll see you in the next one.